How's it going, everybody? Welcome back. Today what we're going to be talking about is installing the insulation inside of our structure. I'm going to show you the way that I did it and how easy it really is. The beginning portions of this video focus around getting ready to install your outlets when you are installing insulation as well. Now, there's different ways to do this. You don't necessarily have to do it the way that I'm going to do it here, but this is the way that I feel more comfortable doing it, and you're going to see why. Again, if you are building this structure for a small little playhouse, you don't care about too much, you don't care about any lighting going on inside or any wiring, then you're going to be able to skip the first couple steps. But if not, keep watching this portion. So building this structure itself, and again, it depends on how you build yours, I went 24-inch on centers. When you have the fillers and some areas where you had to place extra studs, obviously things change from 24-inch on centers to 22 inches to 18 inches, just depending on the structure itself. So obviously our max is 24 inches on center, so we want to make sure that we are looking for 24-inch insulation. Alright, so one thing that you want to do before you actually install any electrical or any insulation is know if you have to add any additional studs or bracing or anything that you're going to do for the future plans. What I'm doing here, I have to add bracing because I know in the future that I want to build a frame for a bed above, kind of like right above my head level, for the kids to be able to climb a ladder and get up onto the top of onto a bed, basically, somewhere right around 69 to 70 inches above. So because of that, you have to build some sort of bracing out of wood, obviously, right here within the structure. Now, that bracing contains what it looks like studs, basically, and with the wiring going through all the studs, which I'm going to show you later, you need to have those in place so that you have to be able to bore through those studs in order for all the wires to go through. So make sure you do all your steps first before you start preparing. Alright, so all I'm using here is just a 2x6 piece of wood. I had a lot of 2x6s laying around just because of the fact that we actually built the structure already, and there was a lot of pieces left over. You can use a 2x4 if that's what you have lying around. Just remember, 2x6 is wider. You're going to have a better shot at hitting more wood. The 2x6 that I'm cutting here is just the distance between the stud to stud that I actually measured prior to making this cut here. Just verify your work and head back into the structure. Alright, I do apologize that the camera was a little low on this portion, but in just a little bit you're going to be able to see it. I'm going to move it up a little bit more so you have a better view. But you can see where that blocking is going right there between the two studs. Do whatever you can to make sure that you're going to have a flushed, straight, leveled, as close to leveled with these 2x6s as possible. Your main goal on this is to obviously get as level as possible and to have it as flushed as possible with your studs. You don't want it any further back, you don't want it any further forward. You don't want it to affect the sheetrock, definitely, and you don't want to have a gap between the sheetrock and the 2x6 when you're going to attach whatever structure you're going to attach, whether it be a bed or a shelving of some sort that is going to be holding some heavy material. This is what you need to build prior to that, because the anchors for sheetrock screws, or any kind of anchor you're putting into sheetrock, is going to not work for heavy material. This will. So even if you're not putting a bed up and you're putting a very long piece of plywood on a frame, and you're going to be holding a compressor up there or heavy wood or whatever the case is, anything that has weight, you need to do this. All I'm using here are some screws from Deck Screws, actually durable screws. Make sure you're using actual durable ones, not cheap ones, or you can nail these in. I'm going to show you right now how to kind of toe nail a screw underneath because of the fact that we have two studs on this portion. So when you run into two studs, obviously you can't get a screw through both of them to get enough length into that actual blocking itself. So just put that nail on the bottom of it and screw it in like if you're toe nailing a nail in. Same exact idea. You're going at an angle. Just make sure that you're close enough to the edge of the 2x6 to be able to meet that stud. but at the same time not too far at the end of that 2x6 that's going to rip a hole in the corner. So just be smart about it, know your distance, know your angle. Alright, and just make sure that you're actually using a screw that's, 3.5 inch, something that's going to be long enough to go through the 2x6 and into the stud and give a good grasp onto it. And also don't forget to screw in your edges. I'm just using the same exact screws, 3.5 deck screws. It's going to hold, it's going to do the job, nothing else that I need for that. Alright, so I'm also going to toenail the screw from the top portion of the 2x6 into the stud also. So again, using the same technique, the 3.5 inch screws, and we're going into the angle. Just make sure you're not too close to that corner to blast a hole through that side of that 2x6. And make sure that you're close enough that it's going to give a good grasp into the 2x6 and into the stud. And that's it. Once you have all those screws in place, that blocking is good, ready to go. So not every 2x6 is perfectly straight. You'll be lucky if you find the straightest 2x6 there is. But we managed to use this one. We got it flushed with the studs, and we got up to the level and the line that we wanted. That's all you want with this. And your next step now is applying what you can consider some sort of legs for that blocking. They're going to be additional studs, and this is the reason why you want to do this before you get your electrical portion prepared, because you're going to have to bore through these extra studs you're putting in here. So all I'm using here is just some 2x4s. Make sure you use the same exact width that you are with all your framing. So just measure the length from the bottom plate to the bottom of your blocking. Make that measurement as accurate as possible, and then make your cut with a miter saw or circular saw, whatever you have. Alright, so here's your extra support system, which looks like another stud, and you want to make sure that it's as flush as possible. Obviously the 2x6 is not flat enough on that bottom corner portion, that's why it looks like it has a little indentation, but as long as nothing is being pushed outwards, that's your main goal. And whatever you prefer, you can either nail this in or you can screw this in. All I'm going to use right here are a couple nails. Just go about one every 6 to 8 inches and you'll be perfectly fine. Just get it attached to that other stud. If you decide to go with the nails, just make sure you're using nails that are long enough. That's going to go through this one bracing portion and the stud itself and have a good grasp. And then this is what your one support system side should look like. Now you have to do the same with the other side. Alright, so now both support systems are in place. They are nailed or screwed in, however you decide to do it. And now you can see that the bracing is supported by the screws that are on the sides, as well as the bracing that are on the bottom portions that are acting like additional studs or legs, if you would. Now we have to do the same with the opposite side. So your main goal, and it does not necessarily have to be exactly perfect, but it works better if it is. You want to make sure that the opposite side is the same exact length, the same height as the previous one that you placed in. If you're using a 2x6 or a larger piece of wood for blocking, it really doesn't matter, because you know the size of a bolt, you know the size of a lag bolt or a lag screw. You're going to be able to use whatever you want to grasp that, but it's always easier if it's right on. Once you have your blocking in and everything's in place now you know you're not going to have to build any more studs or make any more measurements of that type of nature for framing. Now it's time to figure out how high you want your outlets or where you want your wire to go through the studs. I'm going about every 2 feet here. So keep in mind that just because I'm doing every 2 feet here from the bottom plate up to the actual hole that I'm going to bore in does not necessarily mean that you are going to be placing every single outlet at 2 feet above. It just saves a lot more material when using wiring. If you're putting it as close to the outlet as you can move it up or down a couple inches with the outlet box depending on what you want to do. I did that for every single stud that I know that I'm going to be boring into. Now, again, your outlet doesn't necessarily have to be 2 feet above, but you want that wiring as close as possible so that you're not wasting material. So, at this point, you want to make sure you have a powerful drill. I'm using a hammer drill here, but you can use a corded drill or something that has a little bit more power to it, because you're going to be boring through quite a bit of studs and you don't want to be burning up a battery. I'm using an auger bit here. You can use an auger bit or a spade bit. I would recommend those two products, those two bits, for this type of project here. You want to make sure that it's powerful and big enough to bore through your studs, as well as big enough to get that wire through. When it comes to your corners, you want to make sure that you bore a hole through one stud and make it almost a 90-degree with the other side. And you're going to bore a hole onto the opposite side so that you can actually flow that wiring in. So you can see that I have one bored out here. I'm going to go ahead and bore another one somewhat close to 90 degrees, and that way that wire can turn around both studs and make that complete turn, and everything's going to be still flush behind the actual sheetrock. Alright, so to add these portions right here of additional studs or pieces of wood that you're going to need for the sheetrock, you can see that there's a gap. When I made the framing, I did not put a piece of wood on certain corners, as could be done after you actually put the whole framing up. So there's a couple different ways to do this. You can either add a 2x4 straight flushed with that, and then add another 2x4 so that you have an extension. You want to make sure that you have enough wood to be able to connect the actual sheetrock when you put it up there, and you have a place to connect the sides. This is the way that I did it to save some wood. I had some scraps around, and I went ahead and cut some 2x4s, and I made it flush right up against that, and I just screwed them in, and that's going to be my backing for the actual sheetrock. Alright, so time to get creative. So you can see that I don't have an additional stud of any sort or a cripple stud right here underneath the window, so I need to design some sort of bracket or bracing for the light switch. I want it low enough for when the kids walk into here, they have the ability to turn the actual switch on themselves. I am just going to, again, however or whatever scraps you have lying around, this is the little framing portion that I'm going to be building. So you can see, once it's in place, you're going to have the ability to put the actual outlet box, because this is the style that I'm going to be using, is actually screwing or nailing right onto the actual studs itself. So you can see there, now I have enough room for the actual outlet box to fit. It wouldn't fit right against the actual door frame portion, and this is going to work. Alright, so after you have that bracing portion in, everything looks tight, go ahead and finish all your holes and all your studs to make sure that everything's going to flow through easily. I went through every single stud that I know that I'm going to be boring some wire through. It's pretty simple. Follow the same procedure, same steps, go about every 2 feet, and you'll be ready to go. The reason you want to do this before you put the installation in is because you do not want to cause any fires. This thing does smoke up some. Alright, as funny as this looks, this is what you need to be wearing at the minimum when installing insulation. It has fiberglass. You don't want any of that stuff touching your skin or anything around your eyes or inhaling any of it. So this is what you want to wear. Alright, now getting started with the installation, we're using Johns Manville's product here. The one thing that you want to make sure that you're looking for when purchasing this is the width of this. You want to make sure that you are looking for whatever, if you did 24-inch on centers, you want to be going for the closest to 24-inch on centers for the width. If you are doing 16-inch on centers, look for 16-inch on centers. Installing this product does not require 2 people. It could require 1 person to do it. It just is a lot faster if you had 2. That way you can work on one, the other person can work on another. But the tools that you're going to want to use for this is strictly just a stapler of some sort, whether or not you have a handheld stapler or a compressed stapler, whatever you have lying around or whatever you can use that. If you don't have one, I highly recommend in purchasing one. You're gonna need that. You're gonna need a stapler for this type of project. The actual insulation that we're using here, it has some thickness to it, so you have to push it and force it in a little bit. It's not hard to move around, but you do want to make sure that it is flushed up to the top and push it in so that you know that all the wood, all the sheathing on the outside is being covered from the inside. That's your main goal. You want to insulate it. And then I'll give you a closer look right now, but on the edges of the insulation, it has paper that kind of extends out. Now, what you do with that paper is it goes flushed against the stud, and you're using the stapler to staple that in. Now, here's a closer look at the tab that I was explaining before. This ending on both sides of the actual insulation, it has this paper that extends out. All you have to do is flush that against the stud and staple it in. It's pretty simple. It's very easy to install this. Just make sure that the actual paper portion is facing towards you and the insulation is facing outwards. And here's the other side of the insulation. So once you have that first tab in, you can go ahead and start putting this other side in against the stud. Now, this does not have to be perfect. It does not have to be lined up with anything. You just want to make sure that it actually gets attached to the stud. It looks a lot prettier if it's nice and flushed. If you're not worried about, if you have a while to go and you're going to have some people looking at your work and you still have to put the sheetrock up, you want to make sure that it looks flush. And especially if you're doing this for somebody else, you want to make sure that it looks great. But at the same time, if you're doing it in your own little structure, it does not need to look perfect. All it has to be is secured to the actual stud. And it's going to do its job. Just make sure that you're putting enough staples in that you know that it's going to hold, and you're not going to regret not putting enough staples in the future. So keep in mind, the insulation is going to cover over the bored holes that you already made. You want to make sure that you mark on the outside of the stud an area to where you are going to know where those holes are at. And that's exactly what I did here. Just a pencil line. Doesn't need to be level, doesn't need to be flush. Just make sure it's lined up somewhat close to those holes. And that's basically how you install insulation. It's pretty simple. I recommend getting the thickest portion of insulation that you can. The R13 is what I bought. It's not the highest quality, but it's going to do for a shed or a playhouse. If you're doing a structure for a home, go for something different like an R30. Alright, so I'm just going to show you in real time basically how easy it is to put one of these up. Just pull out a piece of insulation. They're pretty flat coming out of the actual baggage itself, the packaging it was in. Once you install it and the air, the weather, and everything starts to get to it, the heat, the cold, whatever, it starts to expand. That's basically what insulation does. It's going to hold all that weather in, and that way it doesn't come into your actual structure. There are different types of insulation. You have the foam, which works just as well, which we are going to be using on this structure when installing this insulation, and I'm going to explain why. The price of this type of insulation here was right around $80. And it comes with about 11 pieces, I believe it was, within the package itself. I need, if I remember correctly, it was about 15 pieces or even 16. Now, I didn't want to have to purchase 2 packs of insulation. One I needed, however, I didn't want to have an extra amount of insulation that's just going to be stored away. So what I did was, after I purchased this one, and I know that I'm going to install all 11 pieces, I bought some foam pieces as well, and that's going to cover the remainder that I needed. I'd rather waste foam and throw that away or give it to somebody else that can use it for maybe an RV of some sort or whatever the case is, or if they need a little bit of insulation for something. I'd rather waste foam material because it's a lot cheaper than wasting or storing 5, 6, 7 different pieces of insulation in a shed or storage. Also, keep in mind that foam pieces, depending on the thickness or whatever you're making, you could build countertops, concrete countertops with foam. You can't do that with insulation. So if you want an extra piece of foam lying around, if you're going to build a countertop, well, there you go. You already purchased it. Alright, so here are all the pieces installed from the package itself. Just keep in mind, you want to try to avoid making any cuts on the insulation. Don't worry about it not fitting in perfectly flushed like some of them are, and some are, you can see, they're crinkled up. As long as you put them in there, it's going to do the job. Some of these studs are a little bit smaller within the length as others, just based on fillers and the bracing that we needed to put in. So some are smaller than the others. Not all are exactly 24 inches. All right, so here's the foam piece that we're going to be using. You can see this is great insulation just as well. They sell them by different thicknesses, and depending on the thickness is the price you're going to be paying. These ran about $10 a piece. So we're going to need to cut these pieces. Now, the way to do this is to measure from the bottom portion to the top portion and make sure that everything's the same amount. So let's say that this portion right here was right around 18 inches. Well, you're going to be marking your piece of foam at 18 inches, and we're going to snap a chalk line. So you can see how big this actual piece is. You can cut it from either the top or the bottom. It does not matter. The bottom portion, the white portion, actually has some lines and markings for you to make it a little bit easier. Alright, so as explained before, let's say that this was an 18-inch slot that we need to make sure that we're putting this insulation into. You're going to mark 18 inches on one side on the very top of it, and then 18 inches on the bottom side, or whatever the size is that you need to fit between your studs. Once you have that, all you're going to do is grab a chalk line, put it against the first marking that you made, or the last one, doesn't matter, and just go ahead and snap your chalk line. Now, people say that you can use a razor blade or an X-Acto knife of some sort, or a knife or something that cuts this type of material, something just a hand tool. You can do that. It's going to take a lot longer, in my opinion, to do it that way. If you have the ability to use a jigsaw, or you can borrow it from somebody, use a jigsaw for this. It makes the process so much easier, and you're going to see just right now how fast it cuts through this. Now, no matter what you do, whether or not you use a razor blade or you use a jigsaw, you're going to have little tiny white particles flying all over the place. It's just part of the process. That styrofoam is going to end up leaving some particles around. Alright, so all you're going to do right here is just grab your jigsaw. If you need some sort of guide, go ahead and use one. This is pretty simple stuff to cut through. You just, freestyle in it basically. You don't need a guide, just follow that chalk line. But if your hand's not so sturdy, after working a couple hours, sometimes your hand decides to twitch on its own, and you really can't control that. But if you have the ability to keep your hands still, you have the ability to follow this chalk line with a jigsaw. And you can see all the particles flying all over the place. It's just part of the process. They are kind of hard to pick up, if you're sweeping it up or something, but if you have a blower, just blow them all out. It's gonna clean up easily. Within the time that the wind even picks up, this usually just pushes them all into one corner anyways. But again, this is as easy as it is to cut this type of material. Alright, and once you get towards the end, it's going to be a final cut. And this piece right here should fit in, if you measured it correctly. It should fit in right into the slots of the actual studs. So just make sure that the reflector side goes out towards the actual outside sheathing, and the foam portion is facing inwards towards you. That reflector is supposed to be able to bounce the energy back outwards, and the foam's going to be keeping all the energy inside. So when making this cut, keep in mind that the height of it also may need to be adjusted. So if it doesn't fit in perfectly fine because of the fact that it's too tall for the actual structure that you built, all you got to do is cut it. Same exact idea. Just make a marking and cut it with a jigsaw. This is as simple as hitting it in with your hand. You can use a rubber mallet if you have one, but your hand works just as good to be able to push this thing in. You don't need any additional strappings, no nails, no nothing. It's just going to be placed in there. As long as it's nice and tight, it's going to fit in there and it will not move anywhere. So now that we have an understanding of how that works, I'm going to go ahead and start filling in the remainder. If you have any pieces that you need to cut because of an offset of any sort, all you have to do is measure around with a tape measure. Just measure from the bottom to that actual obstruction portion, measure the thickness of it, and then measure the height of how much you actually need to cut off. And it's as simple as doing that to make it fit around that. And all you're going to do is just cut that piece out to size. Make sure everything fits in. If you are a little too tall on one side, just shave it down either with a jigsaw or a razor blade you can use, just to kind of trim it. And just again, just use your hands to push this thing in, and it's going to stay nice and tight as long as it's cut somewhat to size and you're not using like an inch gap between the stud and the actual foam itself. It's going to fit. So just make sure that you are actually filling every single gap that you possibly can see with insulation. That's the whole point in it, is to keep it nice and weather resistant, basically. So if you have any little gaps anywhere between the studs or anywhere that's you can see actual sheathing, make sure you have foam there. So far I have all the big areas covered with the regular insulation to include the foam insulation. And now it's time to get on to the actual small cuts. It's going to be the same exact thing. Just make your measurements and use a jigsaw to cut it. It's so simple using the jigsaw, and I highly recommend that in this portion of the project. So this is where I'm at so far. I have all the walls covered with this insulation. I do not have the roof covered just quite yet. The only reason being is the material. I didn't want to have to purchase and store material until I'm ready to work on the actual roof. I did, however, want to purchase and use the insulation for the walls because of the fact that I'm going to be working on the electrical next. So this is getting everything prepared for the actual outlet boxes and the running of the wire. All that stuff is going to be able to be installed now just based on the fact that I already have the insulation in. So this is a pretty simple project. It just takes some time, some measurements, and some cuts. There is nothing to it, and you can see how easy it really is to do. Thank you guys very much for watching the video. I really hope this gave you some sort of insight, at least on how to install the regular insulation and the foam insulation, and the reasons to why I purchased both, just based on, budgeting and making sure that I'm not going to store, material away, which I don't know if I'll ever use again anytime soon. And I hope by making this video you can at least see how easy it really is to install insulation. Make sure you're doing this before your electrical work. You can do it after your electrical work, but why work harder when you have to do this anyways? So just make it easier on yourself. So please, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that like button if this video helped you at all. And stay tuned because we are installing the outlets next.